2017年，我国 GDP 总量为827122亿元。
Problems which could critically affect our businesses.
Bring in the Internet of Things. 6.4.
Huawei's new smartphone, the
Business
Honor
strategy
7,
has always been premised on assumptions
Bitcoin's
about
value had
technology.
grown 10 times from the start of the year.
Massive plant in the United States in Michigan.
无人驾驶技术将第一次
正式走出封闭园区，进入上路测试阶段。
automated vehicles are connected and communicating with each other.
让中国的自动驾驶站在世界的前沿。
Tens of thousands of lives a year.
We're going to be building cities for 3 billion people.
An opportunity for the city of Detroit.
We want to solve our climate crisis.
雾霾是什么？它从哪儿来？我们怎么办？
这是我发展的一个基本的体现。
And Bill Walton, ladies and gentlemen, Yao Ming.
McLean is also back.
Pressure. There's the blitz up the middle from Devin Bush.
The programs have already been practicing on the field.
Visible Wolverines are the Big Ten Tournament champions.
底特律，美国最大的汽车制造业中心。中美两国乒乓球运动员体型的第一。
East meets West as a handshake
bridges. Established in 1961.
Singled out for the wrath of Donald Trump.
Donald Trump's visit.
2017年，我国 GDP 总量为827122亿
For
元。
problems which could critically affect our
Bring
businesses.
in the Internet of Things. 6.4.
Huawei's new smartphone, the
Business
Honor
strategy has
7,
always been premised on assumptions
Bitcoin's
about
value had
technology.
grown 10 times
是
from the
这
start
听
of
到我
the
们
year.
库房生产。
Massive plant in the United States in Michigan.
无人驾驶技术将第一次
正式走出封闭园区，进入上路测
Those
试阶
fully
段。
automated vehicles are connected and communicating with
让
each other.
中国的自动驾驶
Technology
站在
that
世
could
界的
save
前沿。
tens of thousands of lives a year.
We're going to be building cities for 3 billion people.
An opportunity for the city of Detroit.
who want to solve our climate crisis.
雾霾是什么？它从哪儿来？我们怎么办？
这是我发展的一个基本的底线。
And Bill Walton. Ladies and gentlemen, Yao Ming.
The plane is also back.
Pressure. There's the blitz up the middle from Devin Bush.
The programs have already been practicing on the field. Visible
Michigan
from space.
Wolverines are the Big Ten Tournament champions.
底特律，美国最大的汽车制造业中心，中美两国乒乓球运动员举行的第一。
East meets West as a handshake
were
bridges.
established in 1961.
Singled out for the wrath of Donald Trump.
Of Donald Trump's visit.
Good evening, everyone. Let's get started. Welcome to the Michigan-China Forum. The event tonight is In and Out of Sino-US Tech Entanglement. I am Jason Law, a PhD candidate in political science at Stanford University. I'm really happy to be your host tonight. Before introducing our forum and our distinguished speakers tonight, I would like to thank each and every one of you for coming and participating. We are live streaming right now on 3 platforms: Zoom, YouTube, and Bilibili. There are about 100 people right now. During any time of the event, you can post your questions in the Q&A box on the bottom of your Zoom screen, or leave comments under the YouTube and Bilibili comment section. We'll try our best to incorporate your questions and comments, hoping this will be an engaging discussion, and we will all walk away with, if not improved confidence, at least more thinking on US-China relations. Several words about our host organization, Michigan-China Forum. Michigan-China Forum is a nonprofit student organization registered at the University of Michigan. Its mission is to empower future leaders of the United States, China, and beyond to excel in a global landscape. Through discussion, MCF connects students, scholars, and business executives from a wide range of backgrounds and environments. These connections give people the freedom to engage in conversations, gain insights, and explore the possibilities for international collaboration. Let's get started now. Tonight, we have 3 parts. First, a keynote speech, then a panel discussion, followed by a Q&A session in the end. First, keynote speech. Our keynote speaker tonight is Carrie Brown, Professor of Chinese Studies and Director of the Lao China Institute at King's College London, Professor Brown also served as the first secretary of the Embassy of the United Kingdom in Beijing, then as the head of Indonesia, Philippines, and East Timor section and the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office from 1998 to 2005. He is the author of over 10 books on modern Chinese politics, history, and language, including The New Emperor's Power and the Princelings in China, 2014, What's Wrong with Diplomacy, The Case of the UK and China, 2015, China's World, What Does China Want, 2017. He will deliver by video. Without further ado, here is Professor Carrie Brown speaking.
Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to speak remotely this University of Michigan conference on the important issue of the US and China and where they'll be going. It has been a really tough few years for US-China relations, and possibly this was something to be expected. These were never going to be very easily compatible parties. First of all, because of their profoundly different views of the world, their different political systems, but also because of their very different values. I thought in this short address, I would talk about broadly 5 things. And I'm going to use the acronym MOSES. I'm going to talk about mindset, options, strategy, endgame, and then I'll summarize. Acronyms are always a very good way of trying to remember what one wants to say. In terms of mindsets, I think that for America, in many ways, like in Europe, where I'm based in the UK, in London, there is a comfortable assumption which needs to change that China is somehow in intellectual and technological deficit to the developed West, and that it is still looking for things that we have. I think it's pretty clear that in many areas, from artificial intelligence to areas of medical research to areas of technological development, China is really starting to produce its own proprietorial intellectual property. Now, it probably needs to work as hard on protecting its own intellectual property rather than being accused by others of stealing theirs. I think, therefore, it's easy to say that China will, as it becomes more technologically powerful, want a robust intellectual property system. It is the one that is most likely to be now stolen from, rather than, I suppose, in the past, the one that was always accused of being the stealer. So these mindsets of China somehow still being backward and out of time and a kind of technology pauper, I think these are obviously clearly got to change. In The Economist this week, lots of talk about a huge Chinese fintech company. So lots of talk about the ways in which Chinese companies in all sorts of areas, from high-speed trains, mobile payments, the use of daily technology and social media and other things in people's lives. This is all, I think, showing that there are plenty of innovative people in China. So mindsets clearly need to be updated and they need to change. We're not dealing with a China which is some kind of minnow in this area now. We are dealing frequently with an equal, and we may well quite soon be dealing with a partner which in some areas is superior. The success of TikTok in particular and the issues around TikTok are symptomatic, I suppose, of the fact that Chinese companies would really prefer America to be part of the world. But I think Huawei shows that the options of a world without the US are not so devastating. Huawei's profits have been good in Africa and Latin America and through South Asia. Its profits domestically are also fine. You can go it alone. And until recently, I guess China always felt that it had to have the US on side. I guess what we see today is a China which is more and more aware that there can be a world without the United States, and it's not so bad. It's preferable if the United States is there. It's mutually beneficial, perhaps, but it's not the end of the world if it isn't. So options, I think, are now becoming much clearer. And I think the options for people in America in particular, Canada and elsewhere, What do you want from China? Have you thought it through in return for dealing with what China wants from you? A strategic approach, I guess. There are investments, job creation opportunities, access to new technology that Americans could have, just as in the past they had access to cheaply manufactured goods. But clearly it has to be a properly balanced and reciprocal and sustainable deal. That brings me, therefore, to strategy, this issue of what should be a strategic approach. It's often been striking over the last 10 years in particular that China often seems to have a clear idea of what it wants, maybe driven by necessity, and maybe driven by the fact that until recently it's been the underdog, and therefore that has given it more explicit advantages. It's better that you know what you're looking for, rather than that you are absolutely unaware or you don't care, even though something might matter to you. With China, I think the great issue is that it has this kind of image, which is sometimes probably not particularly realistic, of having very clear strategic goals, 5-year programs, plans as they used to be, strategic provincial goals, growth goals, all sorts of residues of the old planned economy under the kind of high socialism in the 1950s and 60s. I think in terms of what it wants nationally, politicians in China have had a big role in explicating that. And I think that strategic approach is not one that is so easy to dismiss now, because it has succeeded. I think it shows that China has had some kind of success, and we need to work out as people outside of China what that success is and in what ways we could learn from it. Our strategic goals from China, I think, have got to really be about identifying the enormous opportunities in the domestic market, which so far remain untapped. In particular, the emergence of a great middle class and the emergence of an innovative entrepreneurial business sector. And these are things where TikTok and companies like that might not just be competitive threats, but also have new ways of working with things and new ways of understanding things that we can learn from. Might be indeed that they also have huge mistakes and issues that we can also learn from. But we have to have an open mind. We also have to have an understanding of what it is in the United States and in Europe that we want from China, rather than some massive fight. With COVID-19, in many ways, China and the US have a common challenge now. The National People's Congress in May in Beijing, Li Keqiang, the premier, talked of the need to create 9 million urban jobs in China. This is going to be very similar to the number that will probably be needed in the United States to deal with the collapse in employment because of COVID-19 and its impact. And therefore, a common and urgent language of economic regeneration, which is going to, I think, emerge, means that necessity, rather than anything else, will start people working together. Of course, there is a chance that it would lead to people having real conflict. It wouldn't be the first time that significant economic problems have led to the Second World War was catastrophic, but a world survived. A conflict between the United States and China would probably be one in which not many would survive. Be seeing an America as a nuclear power and a China as a nuclear power, with the two largest armies that the world has ever assembled, with their enormous capacities, basically unable to prevail over each other and probably only able to destroy each other. This seems to me to be absolutely unthinkable. And therefore, I guess our strategy will have to be working out a greater definition for what is our self-interest as people outside of China, and what ways we have a pragmatic framework to work with opportunities in China and with Chinese in ways that do not undermine our own values and our sense of what we need and should do to protect those. What is the end game from that pragmatic engagement? I suppose until recently in the United States, the end game of engagement was to lead to a happy day in which China would politically change. I think I've said earlier that is less and less likely to happen, at least in any easy or straightforward way. The end game could be that in America there is a sort of self-protection. We can't change China, but we're definitely not going to live in a world in which China is dominant. We will make sure that it does not have access to us. That would be decoupling. But I think that it's not likely to be a story that we're going to hear in any easy sense from here on. China and the US, if they wish to decouple, will also have to recognize significant mutual dependency, no matter who ends up with the world's biggest economy. What is certain is that there needs to be some architecture to enable these two enormous powers to somehow deal with their significant competitive issues and their very profound differences. We can see this complexity emerge through issues like TikTok, Huawei, and other technology companies. Yes, you can say that they shouldn't come to the United States. But then in terms of supply chains, in terms of customers, in terms of trying to divide up virtual space, in terms of alienating maybe significant numbers of people in one's own country who, for instance, are users of TikTok and WeChat, and also in then blocking off future opportunities for technological development and innovation. These are not easy things. And therefore, I think if we look at the kind of end games, probably to acknowledge the significant differences in terms of values and political systems, a management of those differences, an end of idealism in which one wants to prevail over the other. It's more often the case America than China, and a sort of just acceptance to live and tolerate each other. That won't be an easy thing to do, but it's not impossible. And indeed, there probably are instances in the past where you did have powers that didn't particularly get on with each other, but they managed to put up with each other. So how we manage this and how we build the architecture to make sure that this is not going to be a world which is perpetually flaring up in crisis, that will be something that will be an enormous job for diplomats. And so for the summary, I guess it would be good to just stress this issue of mutual need. In many ways, the great opportunity is that we do see a world of real pluralism. After all, this is one of the great desires of Enlightenment values in the West, that you can tolerate different views, different opinions. You don't have to impose worldviews on others. One of the anomalies really is that this has not been easy for Europe and America to tolerate the emergence of a power that doesn't dissent from their values, but says that it doesn't adopt them. In a sense, this is an extraordinary act for a country to do, to say that its cultural and philosophical and intellectual background is such that it has hundreds, maybe thousands of years of intellectual reserves in which it can say, we don't dissent from you being you, but we want to be us. This world sounds disorientating, but I think it's actually a world which might be incredibly fruitful, a world which might be very stimulating. Who knows? When there is greater tolerance between powers, there might be far deeper technological and intellectual engagement. These things, after all, never did have any boundaries. Maybe that's the world that we would wish to aim for, a world in which we really can have a kind of great diversity. And that diversity is the thing we all embrace and accept. This is not to deny that in terms of technology as a subset of these bigger issues that we're talking about, there are not going to be enormous challenges. And one of the things that is most important as we face that is being well informed about what the challenges are. An investment in knowledge in that area is very important, which is why the kind of conference that you're holding in the United States at the moment and inviting people like me from outside to address is so important. In essence, therefore, the things that I think are important to think about, the MOSES acronym, mindsets, an idea of China always being in deficit. Now, I think intellectually in areas, pretty significant areas, it's moving into surplus. Options, the idea of having some spaces where we can work together, some where we can't. Strategy, a clear idea of what we might want from China and China want from us. Endgame, sense of where we're heading to and what might be operational as a viable world system. And then summaries, which of course brings all these things together. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope that you have a successful conference. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity to engage and talk with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Brown. That was thoughtful and encouraging. Let's now move to our panel discussion. We are very honored to have three distinguished guests on our panel tonight, and let me introduce them one by one. First, an old friend of our MCF, Professor Suishen Zhao. Professor Zhao is the director of the Center for China-US Studies and the University of Denver. He's also the founding editor of the Journal of Contemporary China, a prominent multidisciplinary academic journal on contemporary Chinese affairs. Professor Zhao has taught as an honorary professor at Peking University, Fudan University, and Renmin University of China, among others. He's also a prolific writer of more than 10 books, including China and East Asia Regionalism, Economic and Security Cooperation and Institutional Building, 2012, and In Search of China's Development Model Beyond the Beijing Consensus, 2011. Welcome, Professor Zhao. Secondly, we are very happy to have our industry experts, Mr. Jordan Gross. Gross is the Senior Government Relations Lead and DJI, or Dajiang Innovations, an internationally leading Chinese company in developing and manufacturing camera drones for aerial photography. Before joining Dajiang, Mr. Gross works as a manager in the Tech Policy Division at the US Chamber of Commerce. Good to have you on the panel, Mr. Gross.
Thank you very much.
Lastly, but certainly not the least, we are thrilled to have Professor Dimitar Guyoyev, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Syracuse University, whose expertise is on Chinese politics, comparative autocracy, research methods, and foreign policy. In the Chinese context, Professor Guyoyev's research mainly revolves around regional strategies and institutions for harnessing public participation for the instrumental goal of staying in power through improved governance. Some of Professor Guyoyev's papers have been published in the Journal of Politics, American Journal of Political Science, and the Journal of East Asian Studies, and the Asian Journal of Economics. Professor Guyoyev's co-authored book on Chinese governance institutions, China's Governance Puzzle, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. His second book, Manuscripts on Digital Participation and Authoritarianism, entitled Retrofitting Leninism, is under contract with Oxford University Press. Welcome, Professor Guyoyev.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, without further ado, let's hear what our experts on the panel have to say about US-China entanglement. Let me start with a general question for all three panelists. We know that international trade is important for major country relations. It looks like the commercial collaborations between Chinese and American tech companies have increased in recent years. What do you think of the current economic collaboration between the United States and China? Could you say a few words about the past and current US-China relations, particularly with respect to the technology sector, so we can lay some groundwork for today's discussion? Professor Zhao, do you want to go first?
Yes, the competition now has replaced collaboration as
Carrie Brown mentioned that the decoupling of technology and overall economy has now become a very significant issue that the leaders on both countries have to take a consideration when they plan a relationship, especially the economic relationship between these two countries. Although personally, I don't think the decoupling could be an easy thing to accomplish. But the governments on the both sides have engaged in this type of preparation. The US side has taken initiative, and the China side, in my view, has no choice but to respond and making its own preparation for the long-term decoupling or the competition. In fact, I don't know if you had time to get into that. I see the Chinese government had met the self-reliance, try to have its own innovation strategy to invest a huge amount of funding into the basic research and applied technology. So in a short term or midterm, I'm a little bit concerned or afraid of the development will go toward the direction of the two ecosystems of the technology in these two countries, which is very costly to both countries. But that seems the direction is going to go. Hopefully, the Joe Biden administration would change the US side of a policy, but even the US side changed. I don't think China side would trust the US in the next stage because they have been forced into this fighting. And there is a deficit of trust on both sides. So I don't know what will happen in the next 4 years. Hopefully, we'll gradually get out of this type of, I think it's horrible situation.
Thank you, Professor Zhao. That was wonderful. We will go into more details of the several important things you mentioned. Professor Gross, Mr. Gross, do you want to start?
We can upgrade me to a professor so I can join my fellow panelists.
You are in this panel, you are a professor.
just for today. Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of talk, obviously, of the decoupling and potential harms that would have. I think, one of the things that's really interesting, really from a result of the last 4 years, is that President Trump, or when he was candidate Trump, really sold himself as a master of negotiations. That was one of the primary things that he ran on in 2016. That was what he carried as one of his big accomplishments coming out of business, and things that he would carry over into his role as president. Obviously, once taking on the role of president and looking to negotiate with China through a series of rounds of trade deals, discovered that this would be more complicated perhaps than initially thought. And as while they were successful in completing round one of the trade deal, they weren't really able to get to a lot of the bigger ticket items that were hopefully going to be negotiated. And so what we saw was a bit of a transition, probably 2 years into the presidency, where rather than the normal course of international relations and negotiations between the two countries, we saw the singling out of individual companies. And that's where we've seen, initially with Huawei, and then onto WeChat and TikTok and our company as well, to a lesser extent. But we've seen sort of the specific calling out of different individual Chinese companies when we've seen some of the drop-offs of the larger conversations. So I think, looking into a Biden administration, I think we'll see a bit of a return to more normal international relations, and less so this presidency by Twitter and by calling out individual companies or looking at specific agency actions against a single company.
Thank you, Professor Gross. So now let's move to Professor Goryev, please.
Okay. Thanks, Jason, and thank you to my co-panelists. I couldn't agree more with both those perspectives, and I think they kind of touch on the main aspect of my impression on this specific question, which is that, first of all, it's important to step back and think of the bilateral relationship as it relates to kind of global economics and global supply chains. And I think what we've seen over the last 4 years is just how difficult decoupling is and how difficult it could be when the US passed restrictions, for example, on relationships with Chinese companies, selling technologies to Chinese companies. We saw how painful that was for Chinese companies as well as American manufacturers who were supplying them, and vice versa for American manufacturers that rely on Chinese supplies. And so these relationships are really convoluted, really intertwined, and connected to the global economy. Other countries have been brought into this mess, whether they wanted to or not, right? They've had to choose sides in many cases, whether to abide by US restrictions or to fulfill contracts with China. In some cases, they've tried to do both at the same time. And the worst possible scenario, I think, is what Professor Zhao alluded to, is a situation in which we have perhaps two separate ecosystems. One that is dominated by the United States under US standards, US regulations, and US proprietary technology, and one that's governed by Chinese. That would be a lose-lose situation, I think, for both the US and China, and many of the other countries in the world that are looking forward to stepping into a kind of a more digital technological age. But I'm still optimistic that that's not necessarily where we're headed. And it's partly because of kind of what we've seen happen and how the Trump administration's approach has really kind of unraveled in ways that we're now seeing kind of the specific singling out of individual companies, sometimes in what appears to be almost kind of a vindictive approach, but no kind of comprehensive strategy. And so I think that what that reflects is that it's really difficult to decouple in the way that I think the worst case scenario figured. And I'm optimistic, hopefully, that we won't be headed there. I'm not optimistic, and we'll get to this later, of course, in the discussion, that things are going to necessarily be more friendly in the short term or the medium term. But I think that what policymakers and leaders have realized is that it's not so easy to have a divorce between the US and China. The two have benefited so much from one another over the last 4 decades, and that relationship is just it's hard to uncouple. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Goryev. So now let's move to some specific questions. The first question is for Mr. Gross. In Professor Brown's speech, he talked about the mutual needs between China and Western countries, and also the rise and success of TikTok. Could you talk about what kind of impact do current Sino-US relations have on Dajiang specifically? For example, how is this relationship shaping the operations of Dajiang in the US drone industry? In particular, how does Dajiang navigate policy uncertainties brought by this fast changing, some will say, the worsening US-China relations, particularly in current time of COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in terms of impacts, I put them into maybe 2 categories, which you could probably break down into another handful of subcategories. But it's really about direct impacts and then the secondary impacts. In direct impacts, starting off in sort of the specifically on trade, you could look at tariffs, which have now been in place for maybe 1.5 years. Tariffs, which actually DJI is not really the one paying for. It's our resellers that are importing products and then reselling them here in the US that have bared the brunt of needing to pay for these additional costs. And then things that are a little bit more invasive, there's of course agency actions. And so some of you may have heard of the Department of Interior's grounding of their drone fleet based upon quote unquote security concerns. This was after we had worked with the Department of Interior on developing a government-specific product, one that met the needs of this agency. And yet when new leadership came into the department, they had concerns around how the White House would view their relationship with a Chinese company, and therefore decided to ground not just our drones, but the entire drone fleet. There was other actions from the Department of Justice. We've seen actions by the Department of Defense as well, going back to 2017. So a lot of these agency type actions. The third bucket of direct impacts I would call as legislative proposals. These are initiatives that are coming out of Congress. The most talked about thus far this year has been the American Security Drone Act, which is a proposal from Senator Rick Scott. And what this bill would do, it would ground and prevent the use of Chinese-made drones and drones with Chinese components from all federal agencies, as well as would impact funding as well for state and local agencies that use these products. We've also seen a number of other somewhat similar proposals in the legislative sphere, one specifically targeted towards the Department of Homeland Security and their use of Chinese drones. Really, we kind of bucket all these things together and call them country of origin policies. They're policies that may use security or national security as the basis or the reason for why these policies are recommended. Yet in reality, they are purely based upon the country of origin where the products or the components of the products are being made. Somewhat ironically, what we've seen is because of DJI's market share, estimated 75, 80%, while we are the target of a lot of these types of policies, we've seen other manufacturers, some located in Switzerland, France, actually even American manufacturers, because of the realities of the global supply chain that are also impacted by these policies. And so in some ways, it comes down to not necessarily a full understanding of the commercial industry, of the consumer industry, and not a full understanding of the realities of the supply chain. And so, even American companies are negatively impacted by a lot of these policies as well. The second larger bucket I would call is secondary impacts, and these have actually been much more widespread. The legislative proposals thus far, we've not seen these pass. They've just been proposals. They haven't been implemented. The secondary impacts, on the other hand, are reputational. And so I'm sure if you guys have seen DJI in the news in the last 6 months, unfortunately, it's not because of our wonderful products. A lot of the times it's because of reports that have been funded by competitors. It's because of memos that have gone out about concerns around DJI's security. It's been a lot of things that have been products of these legislative and agency actions that have come out and have poked concerns about DJI's reputation, our brand, and the security of our products. And so when it comes to, what have we done in order to counteract these things, a lot of it has been us really having to bend over backwards and to continue to put a priority on security, being able to continue to highlight the things that we've put into our drones in order for people to have more control over their data, in order to be able to operate without connecting to the internet, being able to opt in if they do want to use our data storage, but having the default be everything to be stored locally. And so a lot of these steps that we've taken, a typical company based in the EU or based in the US might not need to take these steps, but understanding the geopolitical situation, we've had to take a lot of additional measures, even understanding that a lot of the proposals that are out there are based on politics rather than true cybersecurity concerns. Jason, I believe you're on mute.
Yep. That was insightful. Thank you, Mr. Gross. The next question is for Professor Zhao. Professor Zhao, US-China relations is your expertise. You have lived and written about several decades of China-US relations. In recent years, both China and US have issued new policies against exporting key sensitive technologies, the most recent being that in August, the Chinese government ended, quote, technology based on data analysis for personalized information recommendation services, end of quote, to its export control rules, which then complicated this TikTok deal. What do you think of these new regulations? How are they going to impact competitions between China and the US in the field of advanced technologies and also international trade?
This policy change, I think, has in last year or so elicited from US mostly. In fact, the China side for quite a while has this type of so-called industrial policy, try to use other countries' markets. In the meantime, try to somehow protect its own market, and what we call a state capitalist economy in China. The state tries to support a certain type of industries and companies, both and also picked up so-called the champions in domestic and international competitions. For many years, the US has not been fond of this type of industrial policies, and also, in fact, was very critical of this type of policies. I still remember Professor Chang Johnson, who is an expert of Japan studies, also US, China studies. I was his TA when he moved from Berkeley to San Diego. He wrote the so-called MITI, Japanese Economic Miracle, to compare Japan and the US, talking about Japan as a developmental state, meaning that government using industrial policies try to be a player in economic activities, while the US government has never been a player, just a regulator, and try to let the market to pick the winners and losers. However, the Trump administration in the last 4 years, I can see a clear shift from the free market oriented policy to a much more government and central government-led policy. In fact, the tariffs is a very type of a government imposed tax on both domestic consumers and also on the foreign companies. And also in the technology front, for example, you talk about the TikTok, talk about these kind of internet companies. In the past, the US criticized China, tried to ban the US high-tech companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, all those companies in China in the name of national security. In fact, is trying to protect its own competitors in China. Now the U.S. has followed the Chinese footsteps. For me, it's really, really impressive. The U.S. government for many years criticized China's so-called cyberspace sovereignty concept, tried to set up its own rules and protect its internet border, which is so ridiculous. But the Trump administration now has developed similar policy, try to have a, for example, clean net program, try to ban all the Chinese internet companies from the US market in a national security front. But I think it's a very blur, very kind of fuzzy concept. So this change, I think the most important impact has been giving the state, the government, both sides, a lot of powers to regulate, not only regulate, to control their companies and to pick up the winners and losers, which is not supposed to be in the free market system. So when China has a Made in China 2025, now we have a Buy America, which is exactly the same thing of a Made in China 2025, just different names. I find it so interesting. In the coming Joe Biden administration, I'm still a little bit concerned on this front, because this trend has, of the translation and very difficult to stop. I just read an article 2 weeks ago in the Foreign Affairs by Hillary Clinton talking about to build American power, rebuild American power. The recipe she gave, I was really shocked because I thought she's a globalist, was to strengthen Americans' industrial policy, to protect American companies in the international competition, and also buy American. Even also talk about kind of strategic stockpiling of a lot of equipments, which is totally ridiculous against division of labor, against the free market principle. So this type of development is very counter market, and is a strong response to what you talk about, this type of government actions in the US, and has long been the Chinese policy. Supposed to the US change China, but China has changed America, unfortunately.
Thank you, Professor Zhao. Let's look at things from the China side. So this is a question for Guiyev, Professor Guiyev. What do you think of China's US policy in recent years? Do you agree that in the eyes of the American government, China is becoming more and more aggressive and uncompromising these days? If so, how long do you think such trend will continue in the future?
Whether China has become more intransigent, I suppose so, but it also partially reflects the fact that China can dig in its heels much more than it could in the past. I think it reflects that the fact that China has now far more comprehensive and broad-reaching interests around the world. It has so both of those factors. It has far more leverage than it used to in the past, and its interests are much more complex. And so, whatever the issue is, chances are there's going to be more to disagree on, and more ability to disagree. I think that's unsurprising given China's rise, given China's increasing influence, and I don't think that is necessarily a change in form of the Chinese approach. Of course, I would defer to Professor Zhao on this point, but I don't necessarily see a fundamental difference in how the Chinese have approached foreign policy. I do think that the way the US has engaged with China over the last 4 years has been different. I think that there was a change in strategy on the US side, and that may reflect some more of this kind of intransigence, at least on some issues. Right? It used to be the case, at least in my impression, that the United States had a comprehensive approach to foreign policy when it involved China, and for a long time, I think China wanted the US to be more transactional in the types of compromises it wanted, the types of concessions it wanted from China. And I think that that's what they got under the Trump administration. Sure, on the one hand, there was kind of the hostility, the rhetoric, the avarice, especially with regards to trade. But on other issues, there was all sorts of wheeling and dealing that I think the US was willing now to engage in. That was not the case in the past. And I think that China has basically leaned into that approach. And on some issues, it has been willing to compromise. It has been willing to engage in ongoing talks, make concessions, sometimes fairly large concessions, in the spirit of compromise and dialogue. And on other issues, it has said no with much more clear red lines. And so I guess it reflects, first of all, just China has now much more leverage. and it has many more complex interests. But also the way that the US has, I think, engaged China over the last 4 years has facilitated compromise on some issues and cooperation on some issues and intransigence on others. And that may change. We may see kind of a more concerted effort at dealing with China under Biden administration. And that may result in a perhaps a more measured response on the Chinese side, but we have yet to see.
Thank you, Professor Goryev. You made a very important point. If I'm to summarize, you were saying it's mostly a demand side because of China's rise, not the supply side from the Chinese government for these in-transit policies. Professor Zhao, do you want to add something here? Particularly, what do you think do you think the China's US policy is exacerbating concerns from the American side about China's rise?
Definitely. These 4 years, Trump administration has really produced some kind of unintended consequence for the relationship. The Chinese side has called Trump as a 川建国, and the Trump building China. Basically is that not only the Trump administration has met chaos and destroying American value system and American society, but also created opportunities for China. In addition, very important for the Chinese leaders is the wake-up call for the Chinese leaders, for them to understand how far behind China has been in the technology front, and also the overall economic comprehensive strengths. For many years, for example, in the Chinese technology strategy, they have tried to develop applied technology, and the lack of enough funding or investments for the basic science, basic technology, because in the internationalized world or globalization of the world, information flow is very free. And you can get technology information, even that American side China is stealing American technology. And I would say it's the way China just try to get whatever they could get from those developed countries. China has argument, their own, I saw their economists talking about the disadvantage of late development, meaning that we develop late, we can take advantage of those technology, investments, know-how, everything developed by those other countries, and which I think makes sense for quite a while. China has some kind of, from Deng Xiaoping, talking about it's easier to buy and then to innovate, to rent, than to buy. So that type of short-term vision for the quick Chinese called 弯道超车, to surpass others in a kind of a wrong circle side. But Trump's decoupling of technology, basically, as you said, sanctioning Chinese tech companies and stopping those technology transfer to China, banning American companies selling products of American technology to Chinese companies, to Huawei, all those kind of companies, really waked up the Chinese leaders. How much do we rely upon American products, American technology, American science? So from there on, China has changed its strategy in the last 3 years, maybe 2 years, I will say. In the Xi Jinping speech last year at the Science Technology Academy conference, really is a very important speech talking about how China now should rely upon its own innovation, its own technology. And also China should invest hugely in a foundational science and technology, and which has really produced some kind of results. China's technology in certain aspects, certain fields has been really advanced, even more advanced than the United States, 5G, AI, quantum, and many other technologies. So in this type of world, the US is facing a total different China at this time. Maybe in 5 years, China will be even more different. So these two countries really have to figure out how they will do to deal with each other in the long run. What they share the interests, as Brian talked about, what they need each other, and what is the best or most efficient way for them to collaborate, and also competition, and how in keeping the division of labor in the world while finding ways to collaborate. So this type of new changes really pose a lot of new questions for the leaders in the two countries.
Thank you, Professor Zhao. These are very important questions. The next question is for Mr. Grove. So let's zoom in a little bit. We talked about the export controls on technologies just now. And we know that there are in-country regulations on multinationals and entity lists for companies. Over the past few years, the White House has implemented sanctions on Tencent, ByteDance, and other Chinese tech companies. Does, as you said, Dajang have some similar concerns, but to a lesser extent? How is that DJI different from other Chinese internet or high-tech companies that operates in the US? Is it industrial specific? What are some of the DJI's preemptive measures in dealing with these problems?
So, I mean, some of the actions that we've seen in terms of our concerns, I mean, we're obviously have spent the last year, if not last 4 years, really concerned about potentially getting kind of grouped in with the other companies that have certainly been targeted by the White House. It has happened to some extent. So we've seen a draft executive order that was circulating at one point that would be specific to DJI and Chinese drones. Thus far, that has not been implemented. It sits in a cabinet somewhere in the White House and has not been used quite yet. But obviously, knowing that there's the existence of that executive order, that is very concerning. More so in December of last year, Peter Navarro, which folks that are familiar with the trade negotiations with China should be pretty familiar with Mr. Navarro at USTR, is the definition of a China hawk, and has certainly been one of the most vocal voices in the White House in regards to China policy. He actually authored an op-ed specifically about DJI and the security concerns, recommending a number of policy actions against DJI. So we clearly have been on the list and have been concerned. I think in terms of ways that were different than maybe TikTok or Huawei or some of these other companies, and this is certainly a message that we've shared with the administration, that we've shared with members of Congress, is that DJI at our core is not a data company. We are a hardware manufacturer. Obviously, our products do collect data, but there's never a need for any of our users to share any of that data back with us. And so we've implemented features, one of which is called local data mode, which is a bit like airplane mode on your phone, where you can operate completely with no internet connection and not have your operability be impacted. We've taken some other steps as well to be able to carry that message, but it's really a core tenet of the company. And whereas Huawei is obviously an integral part of infrastructure, and you have lots of information running through that network and their products, ours is much more similar to a capture and shoot camera than any sort of part of your infrastructure. So that has really been sort of the top of the line of things that we've tried to communicate. And one of sort of the interesting things that I think both of our professors on the panel can appreciate is DJI certainly has put a lot of investment into Washington, D.C. and understanding the importance of being transparent and being engaged with government officials here in D.C. I think some of the other companies that have been targeted, while now are starting to really wake up and invest in policy and government relations maybe 2 years ago weren't necessarily getting ahead of the game and making these types of investments. And I think it's really important for anyone that's in policy and government relations. It's not just about having lobbyists here on the ground, but it's a part of it's important to be engaging with think tanks, to be a member of different associations, to really build relationships from the ground up in order to be able to establish your brand and reputation. Similarly to how you look to accomplish those goals in a public setting and through PR and in order to impact sales. In DC, it's a much smaller environment where you need to make sure that you are establishing relationships with the policymakers that have the controls either within the administration or within the legislative branches.
Thank you, Mr. Gross. That was very informative and inspiring. Let's pivot a little bit from foreign policy and tech controls and move to the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and the US elections. So this question first is for Professor Guyoyev. How would you evaluate China's efforts of recovering economy during this pandemic? We know that China has almost resumed the pre-COVID economic activity levels, while the US is still struggling badly for an economic rebound. How will China's strong performance in managing the pandemic and recovering the economy alter the Sino-US relations?
Yeah, well, I don't think I have the expertise to pass judgment necessarily on how well China has performed. It appears both on the public health dimension and on the economic dimension that China has done quite well. China looks geared to have if not a full recovery, a healthy recovery from the downturn economically. And some of the most recent news that has come out of China is that epidemiologists believe that it will escape a kind of a winter wave, if we could call it that, of new coronavirus infections. And so, in that regard, it has done really well. I still think the jury is out on where the credit lies for this better than expected recovery. Is it thanks to the state and its kind of more aggressive and proactive efforts at control first, and then more targeted approach to stimulus? Or does it reflect a much more cooperative and I think considerate public that has kind of made a lot of sacrifices and participated in the control efforts and done so without much of the tension that we're seeing in the United States and in other parts of the West. There are, I think, clear differences in how the Chinese approach to stimulus worked in the United States. As most of our viewers will know, we are still waiting on a second stimulus package that has been drawn out for now months. The first package was very large and it wasn't very well targeted, in my impression. And I think that this is kind of similar to Professor Zhao's earlier point, which is that if we look a decade in the past with the financial crisis, it was the United States that had kind of the more measured and targeted approach to stimulus, in China that went with the kind of the big no holds bar approach to stimulating the economy. And now those roles have been reversed. China's response to the epidemic was in the stimulus, the economic stimulus to the economic downturn as a result of the epidemic was much smaller than the United States. It was much more targeted. There were no large cash transfers. China operated mostly on the basis of limited time vouchers that people had to use. And so the Chinese response was, in this case, much more frugal and much more careful. And I think that is not what most people expected. Then again, it's hard to make apples to apples comparisons because China's economy is fundamentally different. China's domestic economy is fundamentally different from the US economy. It's much more concentrated in manufacturing, in larger production zones that are easier to kind of corral, control, and then restart than the service-oriented industry in the United States. But those differences, don't fully explain perhaps why China has been able to rebound so quickly. What that means moving forward, I think that what it means is that China has some confidence. It has some wind behind its sails as it moves forward and kind of anticipates a new administration in the United States, which adds on all sorts of other transaction costs and complexities to foreign policy for the US side that it doesn't add to the Chinese side. That being said, I don't think that we fully have a full picture of the economic damage that coronavirus has had on the Chinese economy, or kind of the lasting effects that it's had on its reputation globally. And so I think that both the US and China, and this is again the optimistic side of me, have an interest in finding some common ground on the basis of kind of a post-COVID restart. And both sides, I think, stand to benefit from dialing down some of the pressure on certain aspects of their economic relationship, because I think even though China seems to be doing much better, it still has a lot to recover, and a lot of lost ground to recover from the last now what, 7-8 months.
Thank you, Professor Goryev. That was insightful and encouraging. Professor Zhao, do you have something to add? Do you think particularly the economic internal circulation policy recently announced by the Chinese government, do you think that's going to work well, conditional on China's current international trade environment and also the US-China relations at the moment and in the near future?
I agree that Chinese government did a very effective job after they realized that the scale of the threat of the virus and took very decisive actions to control the virus quickly. And on that base, they could recover the economy also quickly. They had, I think, a very typical V-shape economic recovery. For sure, that's Trump tried to dream to have, but I don't think the U.S. has accomplished that yet. U.S., as Joe Biden people criticize, is a K-shape of economic development today. And you talk about the dual circulations, domestic market and international market. And China has tried to, in the process, develop its domestic market, rely more upon domestic market, domestic supply, and domestic technology, as we discussed earlier. This is not only the COVID, but because of the trade and also economic tension between these two countries. But on the COVID itself, I have two observations I think are bothering me on this front. One is, in fact, these two big powers and also international community have not come together to collaborate dealing with this common threat. It's what they call non-traditional threat. It's no winners unless we all win. No, everybody will be loser if we cannot control it. That should have a strong incentives for US and China and the international community to collaborate. But that has not happened at all. The blame games between China and the US took place in the early stage of even today. Trump, I think, still trying to blame China. And China blamed the United States. Conspiracy theories, everything flew all over. and also now in a vaccine, which I think should be kind of now public goods, international public goods. The world communities should work together, but US and China has not worked together on this. Each try to develop their own and demonstrate how advanced they are, which I think is not very effective. The second concern I have here is that, in fact, this pandemic has intensified the competition and also distrust between these two countries, and also overall the China and international community. Indeed, China did very good job to control quickly the virus, but the virus starts from China. That's the fact. Nobody can deny that, and nobody can forget that. But China tried to deny that from all the process. And in order to forget that, after China controlled the virus, China launched a very aggressive diplomatic offensive, try to export the China model of crisis management to demonstrate the superiority of the China's political system of authoritarian government, and also to use so-called mass diplomacy and now so-called vaccine diplomacy, medical equipment diplomacy to very target those countries. It's not foreign assistance. They want those countries to show their gratitudes toward China. And you see the standard, they shipped in the airport, those foreign leaders showed up in the airport, Chinese ambassadors showed up in the airport, their ceremony to thank China. And that really gave people an impression China is using its advantage to advance China's strategic and economic interests, and caused a lot of tensions, even between China and European countries, and also China and the United States. China is not the only country which has controlled the virus while using the authoritarian instrument at a very high cost. Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, and a lot of other countries and region and Chinese term also did a very good job. And they did not do what China did after they controlled that. And also they have a different way to do it. And so the way China should in this process to work with international community to show the Chinese, China started this. China tried to make up that, and China tried to work with other countries to help them and also help China. So that's the point. But this type of diplomatic offensive, I wrote an article on this, has really prevented international collaboration on these issues. The United Nations, for example, was very important to play a role in this kind of pandemic. In Ebola crisis, UN Security Council passed a resolution and created funding, created institutions, mobilized resources. HIV crisis, UN Security Council passed resolution, but this went so far. UN has done nothing, only WHO. Even WHO has been criticized by the United States, and also China has somehow kind of has a strange relationship. And so this pandemic, in that context, I'm so disappointed that the opportunity for China and US working together has been missed.
And Jason, if I can add to that,
yeah, please.
I think in addition to the obviously the U.S. not taking as strict and powerful response, I think one of the amazing things to watch here in the U.S. has been I think because of this pandemic taking place in an election year, you've seen domestically how the politicization of so many aspects of the response. So, for example, wearing masks in some parts of the U.S. is still considered to be an indication of which way you go politically. Some of this has been directly from the president. Some of this has been just an effect of conspiracies or just a lack of education or communication from the administration. But it's been pretty incredible to watch where something as simple as wearing a mask, social distancing, following the rules from Fauci and the CDC has become something that is indicative of which way you would have been voting in this last election. And then shutdowns. I mean, we saw President Trump, one of the major criticisms that he made of then candidate, now President-elect Biden, is the fact that he would be re-shutting down cities. And I think it's just a reality. If you look at the numbers from today, it's pretty horrifying. That with the way things are going, it is a likelihood that at some point, depending on the city, it will likely have to do at least some level of shutdown in order for us to get the virus under control and to be able to get to a point where our hospitals are not overflowing. But just generally, just looking at just purely domestically, the way that this has, the way we've really shot ourselves in the foot from a lack of a united response, ability for us to recognize sort of the greater good and to tackle this like we have in other instances in U.S. history. It really just goes to show the status of the country and how divided our country is, that even in this, something that is so non-political could so quickly enter into that realm.
So let me add one point on this. That created opportunity for China
Absolutely.
to criticize America, to criticize American democracy. The liberal model is inefficient, is not capable of dealing with this kind of crisis.
And it led to the election as well.
Exactly. This kind of politicization of these kind of problems in the U.S. really made Chinese people now wondering what's going on in the U.S. And the world also talk about a post-American order. U.S. is no longer the world leader. U.S. Has such advanced medical equipment, but has been the epicenter now of this disease. It's really ironical.
Okay, so let's the last question for three panelists, then we'll open the floor to Q&A from the audience. So the last question is on the US elections and the future. Do you think a Biden administration is going to play soft on the US-China trade war and stabilize trade policies a little bit? Also, in the long run, is the Biden administration going to be better for China and the Chinese people? As many in this virtual Zoom are wondering, especially for international students and Chinese immigrants in the United States, what are the future prospects? Any of you, please jump in. Yeah.
You want me to start?
Of course.
Okay. I'm much more optimistic. I'm very optimistic than for the Joe Biden administration than the Trump administration, because this administration, Joe Biden, personally, I think, will be much more rational, predictable, and orderly, and also interest-based in its policy dealing with China. The Trump administration was very chaotic and did not have an overall strategy, and is so unpredictable, which has not damaged not only to China, but also to the United States. Chinese said, 伤敌1000自损800. The US has been also suffering in this process. I don't think Trump administration will do the same thing. They will try to build the relationship based upon interests, to advance US interests, and also try to compete with China in interest based upon the interests. And the Trump administration treat China as an enemy, and the Biden administration will treat China as a competitor. This is very different. The enemy is as an enemy, you're going to destroy that at all the cost. As competitor, you try to compete for something better, to compete to see who is doing better. Trump administration is to not only compete, to kind of rush to the bottom. Now you should compete to the top. I think that would be the Trump administration's and the Joe Biden administration orientation from what I heard. But in the meantime, China will face new challenges dealing with the Joe Biden administration, because Trump fighting with China just as America first, basically America alone. And the Joe Biden administration would build relationships with allies in Asia Pacific, build the relationship with Japan, South Korea, Australia, all those countries. Those countries had a lot of problems with China in the last several years. And they already responded to China strongly. But that reaction, not because of a US leadership, but because of their own threat perception. So now the Joe Biden administration will build their relationship upon those shared values and shared interests. And also the Joe Biden administration will do more multilateral level, not only at a bilateral. China, US, would work with international organizations such as TPP, such as Quad, such as WTO, all those kind of multilateral organizations will be very important for US. US played a very important role. Trump just kicked them away. So US, the Biden administration will come back to work with them. And so China will face a totally different America in that case. Third aspect here is that the US values will be insisted, such as human rights and minority rights, a lot of other issues. China has a Hong Kong issue and Tibetan issue, Xinjiang issue. All those issues will come back to the very forefront of this relationship. So there are opportunities and also there are new challenges. As far as you talked about the academic exchanges, students, immigration, all those things, I think will come back to normal. This will, I think, will come back to normal because there's a mutual interest between China and the US. It's not, I mean, you are in the university, we are in the university. We really like Chinese students. The university tuition, financial well-being depends to a great extent to international students, including Chinese students, and also internationalization, academic environment, having Chinese students and foreign students, international scholars are very important. And the immigration part, I think there are something, some changes, but overall, I think US is a society of immigrants and just have to based upon rules. And a lot of time the rules are not followed. That's a problem. We have to follow rules. Joe Biden is a by book person. That's what I see it, by book. So he will follow all the rules. And those rules would guide the interaction between China and the US.
Thank you, Professor Zhao. That was very clear and encouraging. Professor Goryev, do you want to go next?
Sure. I think I agree with all of that. We are definitely likely to see much more coalition building on the part of a Biden administration. And that's going to be, I think, a wake-up call for China. That the kind of the transactional bilateral nature of negotiations of the Trump administration were really an aberration. And I think that already we're starting to see Xi Jinping come out and make statements internationally, particularly to some of the countries in the to some of the countries in the region, to avoid engaging in this type of coalition building with the United States. So I think that that's definitely going to be one change. And I don't think that that's necessarily, good or bad in any regard. But if we're thinking about simply China's interests, I think, and kind of China's national and security interests, I don't think that that's in favor of those. But then again, the U.S.-China relationship is multifaceted and multidimensional. And I spoke to this earlier. The Trump administration has approached China as kind of a rival, as an enemy, as a scapegoat on many issues, and that has kind of sucked all the oxygen out of the complexity of the relationship. But the fact of the matter is that there are lots of things that China can cooperate on with the United States, including public health, including the climate. And so I think we're going to see moves in kind of rehabilitating a healthy relationship on those dimensions. I don't think that things are going to ease off with regards to trade or economic tensions very easily. The Trump administration, whether we like it or not, I think what it did was initiate a kind of a realignment. And maybe it didn't initiate it. I think the Obama administration already initiated it with rebalancing. But the Trump administration really consummated, I think, a realignment away from Europe and Russia as a kind of strategic focus on the United States towards Asia Pacific and China. That's not changing. And public opinion in the United States, we know, has gotten a lot more critical of China over time. I think part of the problem in kind of gauging where things are going to go next is that we don't have a clear sense of public opinion in China. We don't have a good understanding of what the Chinese public thinks about the United States, and how much flexibility Chinese leaders have on certain issues. China has, unfortunately, I would say, taken a very kind of moralistic stance on certain issues. China is very well known for setting up very clear red lines on certain core issues that it would refer to, and has been very unwilling to budge on those issues. And I think that the Chinese public has, to some extent, internalized those issues, and we don't fully know how strongly they hold some of these, and sometimes mostly nationalistic positions. With regards to kind of the overall mindset, the overall relationship, I do think it's important to draw a distinction, as Professor Zhao made, between enemies or rivals and competitors, because competition is healthy. It's not a bad thing. And my own survey work in China suggests that there is room for optimism. What I see is that, by and large, an overwhelming majority of Chinese still see the relationship between the US and China as competitive in nature, and not necessarily one of zero-sum rivalry. So in that regards, maybe there's some space, but honestly, even my understanding of Chinese public is limited, because China is not an open society. It's hard to peer in. It's hard to understand. We need to do a lot more research to understand what type of kind of political constraints China's political leaders are operating under when it comes to domestic public opinion.
Thank you.
I agree with both the professors pretty much across the board. I mean, as from sort of the industry perspective, I wrote down a note. Both of them talked about the sort of the line between competitors and enemies. I think for industry, we look at the line between policies that are based around economic security and policies based around national security, and how those lines have certainly blurred over the course of the last 4 years. I think if we're going to have policies that are Buy America, or that are preferring a specific companies that are domestic, then let's call it what it is, rather than try to force policies through calling them national security when it's really about bolstering domestic market. And so I think Professor Zhao said he's optimistic. I will say I'm cautiously optimistic. I certainly don't think I think in your question, you mentioned the administration being soft on China. I certainly don't think that's going to be the case. I think it'll be maybe not better but different. I think consistency is going to be something that we can expect, that we certainly have not had during this administration, in terms of the cadence of new regulations on trade. Actually as recently as today, another executive order and another list of I believe 31 Chinese companies and restrictions of U.S. dollars from being restricted from being invested in those companies. It's become a bit regular to see these things pop up on an almost weekly basis. I think during the Biden administration, we'll have a little bit more transparency and a little bit more consistency with a lot of these practices. I think you'd mentioned as well concerns of students, and I think there's a number of policies that we've seen under this administration that would fall under the category of xenophobia more so than a true effective policy. So I am hopeful, certainly, especially for many of my colleagues who are here in the States and who regularly ask me if they should be concerned. I am hopeful that again, consistency will be the word I repeat a few more times. Consistency in terms of what someone who is visiting this country and looking to either work or get an education in this country, consistency in what they can expect from the administration, and not waking up one morning and having the policies be drastically different. Professor Zhao mentioned strengthening of allies. I think that's going to be really core, especially in the first 6 months. Certainly the U.S. reputation on the global stage has taken a lot of damage over the course of the last 4 years. And I think we'll see a concerted effort by the administration early and often to be visiting abroad and continuing to re-engage, especially in a lot of the international organizations. One other thing I should mention is I think looking back 8 years at the Obama administration and their approach to China, I think gives at least a little bit of a roadmap. Obviously, we're in a very different place now than we were 8 years ago. But if you look at the that first list of transition team members from the Biden administration that came out a couple of days ago, a lot of very familiar names. Folks that were either in the Obama administration or that were at least advising the administration. A lot of folks that are from DC firms, and especially if you look at the the State Department list and the Department of Commerce lists, a lot of familiar names that have had their fingerprints over foreign policy in the past. So that I think that gives us a little bit of an indication of what we can expect, and especially how the administration will take perhaps a firm stand in the first 6 months, just to be able to position themselves going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Gross. This is very important and insightful. So we have received actually many questions from the audience, but we are running out of time, so we'll just do one round of Q&A, and I'll read the questions relevant to each of you, and you can pick up some parts of the questions to answer. So there are first, there are several interesting questions for Mr. Gross. There is first question: will a new presidency affect basically disband the TikTok and WeChat? A second question is, since DJI is the market leader in the United States, could you talk about some kind of the impacts that DJI has on the US strong ecosystem? And also, do you think Chinese companies who sell consumer goods in the United States are somewhat hurt actually by their Chinese identity? It's kind of original sin theory. So these are three questions for Mr. Gross.
Yeah, so I think in regards to, and I'll try to make my answers brief as possible. I think in regards to the TikTok and WeChat executive orders, Because those are executive orders and not more formal policy, not through legislative action, it does make it, if they are implemented, makes it much easier for being reversed under a new administration. You may remember at the beginning of the Trump administration, I believe a majority, if not all, of President Obama's executive orders were rescinded, like on day one. So that wouldn't be shocking to me. I've repeated a few times through this presentation that I think the Biden administration won't look to take a company by company approach. We'll look to take more of a holistic approach to working with China, and that would be not implementing those specific EOs would be consistent with that approach. I'm remembering the second question. How do we engage the ecosystem? So, I mean,
yes.
So actually, when I started with DJI, I was really excited to be working with the company because of all the incredible innovative things that the company does and the current status in terms of regulations that we are. And, little did I know when I joined the company that a lot more of my time would be focused on China issues rather than aviation and technology. But putting sort of the main issues that we focused on today sort of on the back burner, we've as the market leader really engaged heavily with the FAA, which is the agency that has jurisdiction over the airspace. We've been part of the DAC, which is the committee which pulls together industry and agency leaders to make determinations about different aspects of the rules that govern the airspace. Most recently, if any of drone fans in here may have heard of remote identification, which will be similar to like license plates, but for drones, we'll be able to increase the level of accountability for both consumer and enterprise pilots that are operating. That's really just one example of the types of policy engagements that we've had. Certainly, we've recognized that with our market share and the fact that we're creating a product that goes up into a very busy airspace, that we've taken steps on the safety side. I mentioned before some of the steps we've taken on the security side, but on the safety side, implementing things like geofencing to protect areas around prisons and airports. We've put a knowledge-based quiz into our software. So before you fly, you're asked 10 basic safety questions. We've put in ADS-B in receivers, and so that's so you have greater awareness of manned aircraft that are in the airspace. All of these steps that we've taken proactively in order to be good stewards and to ensure greater safety. And then I think it's also important to note, while DJI is in the drone industry, certainly one of the big names. When you're talking about the drone industry and the U.S. drone industry, it's important to note that the hardware is really just the tip of the iceberg, and there is an entire ecosystem of companies that are built upon our platform. And so these are companies that develop different types of software that are specific to different industries. There's companies that build different sensors that attach onto our products. There's the resellers. There's companies that train. There's companies that have all different types of aspects and that are utilizing our technology. And so while DJI is very vocal and visible, really we represent millions of pilots, both commercial and consumer pilots, who are using our products, that are innovating upon our products, and that are doing some of the really cool things that you see on the internet with drones. And so it's really important to recognize that strong ecosystem that is here in the U.S., but also replicated elsewhere, but really goes to show our footprint in the U.S. and our investment here, and the impact that we've had on the economy. Third question was about the impact of regulations on consumer or reputational impacts on
yeah, it's like is the Chinese identity a burden? Do Chinese companies sell globally carry some sort of original sin, something like that?
Yeah, so I think for the consumer market, I think probably up until recently, probably many of our US users might not have even known that DJI was the Chinese company. I think that's changed pretty dramatically with the news from the last year, 2 years. But I think it's a little bit of it has its pluses and it has its minuses. On the plus side, we have such a focus as a company on R&D, and we certainly have had been able to tap into the incredible workforce in China and has helped with the scalability of the company. I think on the negative side, obviously, with the current climate, Chinese companies have sort of been presumed guilty until proven innocent. But I think we do feel that a lot more probably on the enterprise side rather than the consumer side. Our consumer business continues to do well. I think most consumers are less worried probably about presumed data security concerns. If you're out taking pictures of your dog on your drone, you're probably less worried than a company that's maybe using drones for critical infrastructure inspections. So there's been a little bit of a gap in terms of the reputational harm. I would say, as much as we have to jump through certain hoops because of our headquarters being in Shenzhen, I think it's also an extreme value add in terms of what DJI has been able to show, the success of a Chinese company and one of the few consumer electronics companies that have really broken through and become a market leader. So while it presents challenges, I think we're certainly proud of our heritage, proud of where we come from, and we're not going to back down from that just because of a poor geopolitical climate. I think it just goes to show that we've got to do even more to be transparent, to be engaging, and to tell our story. But I think we can really be a symbol of a company that's doing things the right way and continue to provide a better picture of the incredible innovation that's coming out of Shenzhen and coming out of all of China.
Thank you, Mr. Gross. So the last question is about TPP. So do the panelists think, because Trump administration pulled out of TPP agreement, do we think Biden is going to rejoin, and how will China react? So maybe Professor Zhao and Professor Goryev can take this question. And because we are, after your answer, we're going to conclude. So if you could say a few final words to the other attendees tonight who concerns US-China relations and the tech sector, like what we mentioned, back to normal, is there a new normal, or should we be cautiously optimistic? That would be wonderful. Yes, please.
Let me take a shot first on the TPP. The TPP was put together by 4 small Pacific nations, and President Obama picked it up and took leadership to renovate it into a regional-wide organization with 12 countries before Trump came to office. The US withdrawn left only 11 countries to be that organization. Japan took a lead and have reorganized that as kind of progress. TPPP, and it's kind of new name. And so in that, with that historical background, I think Joe Biden government would try to get back, because it has a very heavy imprint of his own legacy with President Obama. And so that's the very simple answer. But how could that be accomplished is a different question, would take a while. And TPP's relationship with China is a very complicated. When it started, a lot of people in China thought it was targeted China, try to include China. I try to tell the Chinese people, no, that's not the case, because it's a high level of regional integration and trade liberalization organization, and China could join. The problem for China was the standard, environmental and labor standard, all those standards. China at that time was not up to that level. So after the new TPP, if the US join, I don't think is targeted at China, although many people may think so in both US and China. But I will still argue that it's a regional organization. Both US and China should have a role. In fact, my friend in Beijing, Wang Huiyao, and some other people have strongly urged the Chinese government to join. If the Chinese government could join, the US government join, this could be a win-win situation for both countries. And this kind of trade liberalization and climate change and the pandemic, cross-national crimes, weapons of mass destruction, those are common threats or common benefits to all the countries, particularly to big powers. So TPP, I hope, if the US returns, China could respond positively and become an arena these two countries could collaborate. Final words, as you said, try to be brief. I agree that we should be cautiously optimistic to the next 4 years. There are still a lot of challenges, even for the economic trade issue. People ask me if Joe Biden administration would lift the tariffs right away. I told them, no, I don't think that will happen. It will take time. And even some people in the US side would argue that the Joe Biden administration could use tariffs as bargaining chips with China. Why not use it? The very key word in the relationship now today is reciprocity. That's a key word. In the past, these two countries talk about mutual benefits. Some country benefits more than the others. It's okay. It was okay. Nowadays, no, it's no longer okay. Reciprocity is very important. US, if make concessions, China side should also make concessions. China side makes concessions, US should also make concessions. So the diplomacy, this relationship, depends on this type of negotiation and compromise. And another issue here is that Trump brought us to the verge of Cold War. I think that could be avoided with a new administration. But this will depend on the efforts on both sides. So I'm a little bit concerned about the China side. Now, the Joe Biden administration could also make a mistake. China could make a mistake too. Remember, during Obama administration came to office 12 years ago, Obama administration was the most friendly US administration to China, looking back. But China did not treat him well. And China tried to test him when he came to office. And he tried to reach out to China personally early and positively. And China just ignored all the signals. China gave him some kind of test, such as when the impeccable US ship was on China coast. China said, no, you have to get out. And the US, South Korea, joint military sites in Yellow Sea would have been there for a long time. China said, no, now you cannot have that Washington USS Washington carrier there because that will cover Beijing. You cannot have it. So China tried to put a lot of pressures on Obama. Obama was the first US president making state visit to China in his first year. And China did not respect that. And China did not give him the same treatment as they did give President Clinton and President Bush. So humiliation, very humiliation to Obama. Hopefully, China will learn from these historical nations. Give Joe Biden time, space, and then we can find ways. Otherwise, we mix up again. Hopefully, that will not happen.
Thank you so much, Professor Zhao. Professor Guo Yi, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have too much to add to that. Just underscore a few of the points that Professor Zhao already raised, which is the TPP could potentially be a bridge. Originally, the TPP, the way it was organized, the way it was designed, it was never exclusive to China. It was never formally exclusive to China, but the terms and the standards and the expectations really made it hard to see how China could actively participate, either even in the negotiations, let alone the agreement itself. But things have changed. China has increased its own standards over the last 4 years. It is now a stakeholder when it comes to IP, just as much as it was potentially a violator in 2014. So things have changed dramatically. And so one could easily envision a circumstance in which the US and China use the TPP as a bridge to come together on many issues. And I think that there's room for optimism on this point. And there's also kind of a material interest for the United States to potentially explore that direction. We cannot forget how large China is as a potential market, right? And one of the biggest, I think, problems that the business side, and Jordan will know more about this than I do, but the Trump administration is focused on technology transfer, on intellectual property theft. These, I think, are concerns and issues that are not to discount them at all or invalidate them. They're super important, but they're to some extent old issues, right? And the concern moving forward is really about access to the Chinese market. And I think a lot of the concern from the US side, and not just the US side, but also from the European side, is a lack of trust in the Chinese political leadership, in the Chinese economic elite, that market access, even if promised, would be provided in the future. And the TPP as an international frame, or multilateral framework rather, could provide some of the credibility to any sort of promises that China would make with regards to market access down the line. And so in that case, I think that there's a huge prize that could be pursued through something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In terms of parting thoughts, yes, if we were to kind of go on a scale of optimism to caution, I'm probably more on the cautious side. And again, this reflects partly my concerns about domestic public opinion, both in the United States and in China. I think China has really suffered in the eyes of the American public. And likewise, Xi Jinping's administration has been much more populist and much more nationalistic when it comes to just the global perspective, but especially when it comes to the United States. And I think that will have kind of lasting and kind of sticky consequences on the way both sides approach the new relationship. And I sincerely hope that there will be a more welcoming, a more courteous, and a more kind of tactful reception of a Biden presidency, but I'm not going to hold my breath.
Thank you, Professor Goriev. Lastly, Mr. Gross, please.
Yeah, I don't know if I have, from my perspective, a huge opinion in terms of TPP specifically, but I think I do echo what both professors touched on in terms of the status that we're currently in. I think I'll use my 1 minute to just encourage the participants that we've had join us today. Obviously, if this is a topic that you're invested in and are looking to continue to pursue, I definitely suggest that you continue to be engaged through, obviously, through but also find other opportunities to engage across the U.S. and better to understand the current status that in the current relationship between China and the U.S. I think it's one of the most important things that we can do, especially for our participants that are here in the States, is to engage with folks and have them better understand, how you have been feeling throughout a lot of these policies, because it's one thing we spend a lot of time talking about policies today that impact companies like DJI and impact others, but obviously there is a residual impact on individuals, especially those that are visiting the U.S. or that are pursuing education in the U.S. And so I think it's really important to take this opportunity to explain to your classmates, your American classmates and others, just so they can kind of fully understand the experience that you've had, especially over the course of the last year, where we've seen really politics bleed into personal experience.
Thank you so much. With all that, thank you, Professor Zhao, Professor Goryev, and Mr. Gross. Thank you all for your thought-provoking analysis and insightful opinions tonight. We are very happy and very lucky to have you tonight. I want to also thank the organizing staff of MCF, Michigan China Forum, who worked very hard, literally around the clock, to make this event not just possible, but successful and meaningful. Also, for our attendees, please take a minute to fill in the short evaluation survey, which will have this displayed on the screen shortly, to help us improve for the future. Lastly, we want to appreciate our sponsor, Fantuan Delivery, for supporting the event tonight. Every attendee, you can get 30% off on your food delivery on Fantuan through the following QR code. Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us virtually and Michigan China Forum tonight. We hope to see you in person in the future. Stay safe and be well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello。
麦开了。刚刚是谁在说话？
咱们结束不？
差不多吧。
那可以退了吗？
什么？
可以退出了吗？
可以。